Hi, I'm Liz Seaton. I'm the Deputy Executive Director, or some might like to say these days, the incoming interim Executive Director of Justice at Stake, which is, an exciting growing opportunity in my life, day by day, since Bert will be heading off to his new position in the middle of August. So I would love to be able to stay here for the whole panel and be a part of this discussion, but there are multiple things I have to tend to at this very moment, and I'm going to introduce Michelle Joando in a minute as our moderator, but if it's all right, I'll just jump in for a couple minutes and just give you just a few minutes on Justice at Stake's perspective on diversity on the bench, a little bit of information about our work, about where we're going to go with this in the future, because I just think that might be helpful as a piece of this conversation. And I'm sorry I can't stay for the whole panel, honestly. So I think everyone knows that several years ago, Justice at Stake and the Fair Courts Field wrote a strategic plan that was about building for the future on a set of issues. One of them was a critical piece about diversity on the bench. All of us can see in this country how important that issue is. It's critical to justice, to access to justice, to fair and impartial courts. I don't think our courts can be trusted by the country unless there is diversity on the bench, and better decision-making will flow from our courts when we have diverse benches that reflect our communities. And so for us at Justice at Stake, it's a clear picture and a clear imperative for the country's future. And for me personally, it's part of the reason that I came to Justice at Stake in the first place. And actually, when I first applied to work at Justice at Stake, I applied to be our Director of Federal Affairs and Diversity Initiatives. And then the more Bert and I talked, the more it became apparent that maybe I was going to be his deputy director, and here I am today, taking over for a few months as we search for our new permanent executive director. But on the issue of diversity on the bench, we have had that position staffed for a few years by an incredible woman named Liz Fuji, who I'm sure many of you met along the way. And she came on board just as we were wrapping up our Washington State pilot project. She launched our Maryland pilot project, and she carried us through almost all the way through our Arizona pilot project, which I'm sure you're going to discuss, and did terrific work for us. And the funny part is, in my office still, there's sort of multiple starts of work that will be some of our critical work in the future about, how do we shape public opinion about these issues? How do we shape the opinions of key influencers on issues around diversity on the bench and get them to understand that part of what we need in the future are policy solutions in judicial selection that deliver diverse benches. I think pipeline building will continue to be needed even if we put in place better structural solutions and policy solutions. I think that's going to continue to be needed for a long time, as we have to encourage people who haven't grown up picturing themselves as our nation's next judges. We have to encourage them. They have to be asked more times to step forward and put their name forward. They have to be supported in their campaign efforts, whether they're, a merit selection effort or to run for the bench. They have to be encouraged. They have to be nurtured. They have to be kind of welcomed into the cadre of people who are putting themselves forward to really be the leaders of our least political branch of government, and the one that's most likely to deliver equal justice in this country. And so, that's where we're coming from. Liz moved home to Hawaii a few months ago to be with her family, and she's doing some incredible work out there now. But unfortunately, it's not the work for us anymore. She's been drawn into some amazing work out there and had to, so her work with us has sunset, and we are in active search right now for a director of diversity initiatives. We're elevating the position to one of our director level positions at Justice at Stake. We have some exciting work planned going forward for that, which we can get into in future conversations. But I just wanted to let you know that for us, the fact that we don't at this moment have a staff member in that position is actually indicative of the fact that we're upgrading that position and upping our game on this issue for the future. So that's all I wanted to say, but I do want to introduce this incredible panel who I know are going to have a terrific conversation that I wish I could hear all of. And Michelle Giwando is going to lead this conversation forward. She's with the Center for American Progress, leading their Fair Courts work. It's terrific to have her there. She's an amazing colleague in the movement. And one of the things that I always value in great colleagues is somebody that you could just have kind of a real conversation with. Here's what we can do, and here's what you're working on, and how can we make this all work really well together. And working with Michelle is just like that. It's a beautiful thing. It's really a beautiful thing. Kate Berry and I just met for the first time here. She's from the Brennan Center, and she has been doing some amazing work with us, and especially around helping keep our diversity, our Fair Courts Diversity Coalition work together, even as we at Justice at Stake search for our next director of diversity initiative. So I appreciate that so much. And we've had a long kind of phone conversation. We've just met in person today, but I know we're going to be, best friends forever.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. And Suzanne Diaz from the Arizona Minority Bar Association is here to talk about the work there and what a difference it has made, I think, and where things are headed in Arizona in the future. And as everyone knows, I think Arizona is one of those states that has had some issues in the past in the state around racial profiling and, a lot of other kind of issues. And putting in place, a visible effort around diversity that's about our justice system, I think can help turn the tide on these things. So with that, good luck. Take it away, Michelle, and thanks so much for letting me just sit in for a minute.
And let's just give Liz a round of applause for basically doing everything right now. We appreciate her leadership in so many ways. So hello, good morning. Are we still morning? No. Yes, good morning. I'm sorry, I have 3 kids, so my days usually start around 5, and so I never quite know where I am at any given time. So thank you so much for kind of joining what I expect to be a really robust and intimate conversation. I think that this will be kind of interactive. And that is the way that I think when the good folks at Justice at Stake kind of envisioned these breakouts, that was the goal, right? Let's have some great conversation, but let's also see if we can kind of take something out of this for our work moving forward. So definitely feel open. Again, my name is Michelle Giwando, and I'm excited that we're having this conversation here now, because I feel like it's so timely as we look at what's going on across the country. About 1:18 this morning, the South Carolina State House voted to take down the Confederate flag. And there was a stirring speech by one of the Republican House members, who's a woman, from the Charleston delegation, a Republican, who actually broke into tears and said, I can't believe that this body can't do the right thing. And I'm going to hope that when we think about the memory of Reverend Clementa Pinckney, who was our colleague, that we can do the right thing by his wife and his children. And as I kind of think about the frame, our country, we're really in the midst of these really difficult conversations. The president in his stirring eulogy really had a call to action for us to both examine kind of the, I would say, both emotional and cultural and spiritual ties that we have to some of our maybe preconceived notions or biases. But he also challenged us when he started to talk about implicit bias. And he talked about when you get Johnny's resume versus Jamal. And as we even think about gun control policy in this country and what that means. And so I think particularly for those of us in the legal profession, we are in some ways at the cutting edge of this conversation. We live at the intersection of both culture and the law. And as we think about how we make our democracy more just, these are conversations that I think we should have, but we should also hold ourselves accountable to search within ourselves to see if there are things that we're doing right. Are there things that we can do better? How can we push the conversation? And so this morning, before we get started in much detail, and I can't wait to kind of bring in my friends here on the panel, I want to just do a quick little exercise, okay? So if you live or have family or friends in any of these states, I need you to stand up, okay? All right? You have to say yes. Call and response, people. Call and response. All right, there we go, there we go. All right, Hawaii, California, Nevada, Maryland, Alaska, New Mexico, New York, Arizona, Virginia, or Washington. Congratulations, you live in the top 10 most diverse states in the nation. Congratulations, sit down. All right. Now, when you look around the room, that was the majority of the room. When we think about kind of diversity in practice, the communities which we represent and we come from, the bulk of us live in the most diverse states in the nation. And if you live in the District of Columbia, suffrage, right? I'm so sorry, I always forget my DC folks. DC people are on that list as well. But what that then says to us is that these are the communities that we represent. Now, a few other key facts. As of 2013, 29%, almost 30% of first-year JDs, enrolled students, are people of color. And the most diverse law schools are in Hawaii, the District of Columbia, University of San Francisco, Whittier College, University of California, Thomas Jefferson School of Law, Western State College of Law, Golden Gate University, Barry University, and University of California, Irvine. Those are the top 10 most diverse law schools in the country. And I don't know if you saw, but 2 days ago, the Women's Donor Network released some startling data about elected prosecutors in the country. 95% of elected prosecutors are white. 85% of the prosecutors run for election unopposed. There are 2,400 elected prosecutors in America. Only 1% are women of color. In the criminal justice system, we know the role of prosecutors. And 79% of prosecutors are white men, 16% of prosecutors are white women, 4% of prosecutors are men of color, and 1% of prosecutors are women of color. Why is this important? Well, we also know that prosecutors tend to be a pool that are often tapped to become judges. Whether you're talking about on the state bench or the federal bench, this is a pool of people that are often identified. So there's a lot of kind of conversation happening about kind of what diversity looks like, what our communities look like, are they representative, and how do we push the judiciary to consider these notions? Are there actual structural things that we should push? I'm going to talk a little bit later about some interesting data that the Center for the American Progress is going to release soon about judicial elections and what that does to diversity. But first, I want to bring in my dear friend Kate, who's going to give some opening remarks. But Kate, I'd also like you to kind of frame with the beginning of your conversation, kind of where are we as we think about judges and diversity? And why are we having this conversation? Are the judges themselves having these conversations? And why don't you come right in there?
Yes, please. Thanks, Michelle. So one of the problems that we face when we talk about diversity is that it's this murky world where people use words like diversity and nobody knows what anybody's talking about, nobody knows what the problem is, nobody knows what the data says. And so at the beginning of my remarks, I kind of want to help frame that conversation, what I mean when I'm talking about diversity, what this problem is really looking like, and how we can get out of this murky, foggy world and actually take action as advocates to help address some some of these problems. So when I say diversity, speaking on behalf of the Brennan Center, I take a very holistic definition of diversity. So I, of course, mean race, ethnicity, and gender, which is what most people kind of package into that word diversity. I also mean LGBT status, socioeconomic background, geographic diversity, religious diversity, political diversity. Additionally, one focus that has really been lacking in the conversation recently is professional experiential diversity. So in our morning plenary, we talked a little bit about Justice Marshall's perspective that he brought to the Supreme Court. And of course, his perspective was infused by a lot of experiential backgrounds, but one of them was his professional experience before coming to the bench. We have particular problems, as many folks know, bringing public defenders and civil rights leaders onto the bench. Just to give a little flavor about what the data tells us. So according to data from 2008, white men are overrepresented on the state appellate bench in a ratio of 2 to 1. During that same time frame, 27 Supreme Courts were all white. Let me say that again. 27 Supreme Courts were all white. 2 had no women. Gender data from 2014 tells us that 29% of the state bench is female. One thing you might be thinking to yourself is, why is this quote-unquote diversity expert giving me data from 2008? That would be a great question, which we should explore later. But one of the major problems in this area is that there are huge data gaps. A lot of the folks in this room are trying to solve that problem, and anybody who has not already talked to me about this problem and is interested, please find me and we can problem solve the data solutions together. Another major problem in the diversity world is that our state courts are super complicated. So all states have different selection systems. Many states even use different selection systems for different levels of court within that state. We heard this morning that Arizona's trial courts, even within Arizona's trial courts, there is a 2-track system. So that means that there's not like a one-stop shop solution to the diversity problem. Different selection systems pose different kinds of challenges, and these selection systems in place within states also pose different sorts of challenges that advocates really need to be aware of. Otherwise, they're going to propose solutions that are not actually useful in practice. The Brennan Center has ongoing research into the problems posed by both judicial elections and merit selection, but because of the expertise of the folks on this panel, I'm going to focus more on merit selection in my remarks. So right now at the Brennan Center, we are in the process of putting together a manual targeting judicial nominating commissioners that will provide concrete steps that they can take in order to recruit, evaluate, interview, and recommend more diverse candidates. Why is this important? There are 2 kind of primary reasons why this type of targeting, I think, makes sense. And if you disagree with me, let's fight it out today on this panel. The first reason that this is particularly effective, in my view, is that 36 states plus DC select at least some judges through a judicial nominating commission process. That means the vast majority of the states can be influenced by this type of resource. The second is that judicial nominating commissioners have vast discretion in making the decisions they make and the procedures that they use, the rules that govern their actions. And so this is a ripe area for sort of innovative policy solutions. The other reason that this is particularly necessary is a lot of the thinking in this area has been pretty theoretical. So some of you are probably familiar with the Brennan Center's 2010 report, Improving Judicial Diversity, that outlined some of the obstacles to judicial nominating commissioners appointing diverse candidates or recommending diverse candidates. But these recommendations are quite wide sweeping and don't provide the actual steps commissioners can take. And my impression is that commissioners are pretty busy, haven't been trained on these issues, and are not going to sit down and write all of our brilliant reports that don't lay this out in sort of concrete ways. So I'm talking pretty generally about what this resource will look like. And I'm happy to answer questions. I'm just going to provide 2 quick examples to give you a little flavor of what this is going to look like, and then we can kind of get into the weeds as this conversation goes forward. So the recommendations will hit on all of the key moments in a commissioner's professional responsibilities. So job posting, recruitment, evaluation, interviewing, and then the actual evaluation and recommendation process. 2 very ripe areas for advice. Recruitment. Data and research tells us that in order to ensure that you have diverse candidates to consider, you need to do more than post the job. You actually have to get out into the field and recruit candidates. Our report said this, the Lawyers Committee report said this, the Justice at Stake report has said this. So basically everybody in this room thinks that that's right. So the guide will recommend that each commissioner must fulfill certain number of recruitment markers, including public speeches, recruitment talks, outreach to community organizations, with specific recommendations of what type of community organizations would be particularly useful. Another ripe area for advice is interviewing. So implicit bias testing and research tells us that this is one of the areas where our biases can creep in the most. This research tells us that transparent interview processes, predefined evaluation criteria, and note-taking can be particularly useful. Note-taking is a especially simple and effective way of combating biases, because research tells us if you don't have notes to refer back to, what happens is that you rely on what you are calling your gut feeling, which tends to be infused with our biases. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my next colleague, and I'm happy to talk through any of the details of this.
Suzanne, I'd love for you to kind of start with giving this group, who may not know some of the great work that you've been doing in Arizona, give them both the context of why you got involved in this work and maybe a few of your outcomes, and we can start from there.
Oh, why? Why did I get involved in this group?
We all ask ourselves that question.
You know, I knew when I became a lawyer that I wanted to be involved with the Arizona Minority Bar Association, and it was one of the committees was judicial diversity, and having served as a litigation attorney, you know, it's pretty obvious. It was pretty obvious that there were very few minority judges, even in Arizona being one of the diversest states in our country. And when you're listing 27 Supreme Courts that are all white, Arizona is one of them. Mm-hmm. We have 5, Supreme Court justices who are wonderful people, but they are all white. We have 2 appellate courts. One of them is in southern Arizona, which I'm thinking of Tucson. I mean, southern Arizona actually borders on this, country of Mexico, but we have a huge population of Hispanics in southern Arizona and Pima County in particular. And on that appellate court, we have 1 Hispanic judge, and the rest are all white, 1 female who is retiring. So that's going to be an opening. So I think it was just, it kind of brings to mind my daughter when she was probably 10 years old, and she's watching the presidential debates, and I'm explaining to her. She walks in and I'm watching. She's like, "What is this?" And I'm tell her what it is. She's like, "How come there are no girls?" So I kind of had that same feeling, like, how come it's not diverse? So realizing there's a problem, that's kind of how I got involved. So long story to a short question, but in Arizona last year, we were very fortunate to have Justice at Stake and Liz Fuji specifically come and start contacting people and saying, we're kind of looking at Arizona because your legislature has kind of indicated that it's not really in support of your merit selection and might try to do away with it and propose legislation to do that. And we want to see if we can help. And what kind of came out of that as we defeated that legislation, thank goodness. But in the 3 counties where we do have merit selection, we realized that there are several things that we can be doing to increase at least the possibility of more diversity on our benches. And one of those was to create this pipeline project that people have talked about. you can't have diverse judges if you don't have diverse attorneys applying to be judges, and we really did not have diverse attorneys applying, and they were kind of self-selecting. You know, our process, just really quickly, we have a commission, a nominating commission, and there are 5 attorneys on the commission and then 10 lay people. The 5 attorneys go through a state bar appointments committee that I actually serve on that also. And we go through those applications, vet them, and make recommendations to the state bar. The state bar makes recommendations to our governor, and our governor appoints 5 attorneys. Then we have openings, we have applicants, and that's where we have to do this recruiting. So we have this pipeline of diverse attorneys. Then the commission selects who they're going to interview. They do the interviews. Those are open to the public, and many, not many, 2 associations at least attend. Arizona Women Lawyers Association does a fantastic job of sending someone to be at all of those discussions. And the Arizona Minority Bar Association has started to send people to also do that, so that the commission knows there's people in the audience. There's 2 people sitting there. You know, they kind of find out later, like, who are those 2 people who are listening to our discussions? They do the interviews, they select who they're going to recommend, and they have to recommend a mixed political slate, I guess. So if there's one opening, they have to, usually, for example, our governor for many, many years has been Republican, so usually they'll nominate 2 Republican attorneys and 1 Democrat attorney, or if they decide to do 5, then they can do 3 and 2, but it has to be mixed, and then they can throw independents in, you know, in the mix also. And then the governor ultimately chooses who to appoint. So that's kind of how our system goes. So we, in talking to and trying to recruit, you know, people to apply, very qualified attorneys who are diverse, I've been told it's not worth my time, because it's a lot of time. You know, it's not worth my time. I'm, you know, a lesbian Democrat. This governor's never going to appoint me. So they're kind of self-selecting, you know, or, you know, fill in the blank. I'm this. I'm never going to get, you know, appointed. So it's an uphill battle, but we did create a mentoring program, and we did at least get, you know, many attorneys, 20 attorneys in Maricopa County, which is Phoenix, and 5 attorneys in Pima County, which is Tucson, to become mentees, and we got judges. And it was through the work with Justice at Stake that we realized these, because I mean, I think at least my initial inclination was to ask diverse judges to be the mentors. And what we kind of, you know, were told was, they're great, they're going to be helpful. You know, we kind of expect that they'll be helpful. We need non-diverse, or, you know,
some good, strong white allies.
Thank you. That's what we need, right there. We need those allies, and so that's who we went. The people with the political power, who are politically connected, to be those mentors, and for 2 reasons. You know, one, they give great advice. But 2, the judges, the sitting judges, are asked by those commission members, you know, I see, you know, heads shaking, yes, you know, you experienced this, to talk about who these candidates are, to give their opinions on these candidates. So if they know these candidates, then they're going to give favorable, you know, responses. And so their support in that respect is also crucial. So those were our, those who we sought out as mentors. And I have to admit that there were 2 in particular judges who, you know, stepped up and volunteered, who were diverse judges who are on, you know, her members of the Arizona Minority Bar Association. And it was very awkward for me to kind of say, thanks, but we really need these other people to be the mentors, because we kind of, you know, expect your support, need your support, and we'll use it in other ways. And I still to this day hope that they're not offended, but you know, I consider them friends. So we did this mentoring program, and we just finished it, wrapped it up. It started about November-ish, and then we had Wellstone come in and do an all-day training on the appointive process. The feedback about that training was extremely favorable. And if you're, you know, doing any kind of similar project, I would, you know, highly recommend that you get a hold of Jesse Ulibarri from Wellstone and bring him and his group in to do the training. People talked about how effective and helpful it was. And we also had, as our wrap-up session, which was last month, May in Phoenix, June in Tucson, it had panels to talk about judicial opportunities other than our state trial, you know, judges, because they're, you know, we have commissioners that serve as kind of quasi, you know, well, they are judges, you know, but they're not through this appointive process. And obviously our city judges, and we have administrative law judges. So we had those, and we have several people who were mentees who are applying. There are, I can think of a couple in Phoenix who are applying, and then one who's applying for the appellate court in Division 2 in Arizona. So we're taking a lot of other steps, and I'll talk about those more later, other things that our state bars are doing.
Great. Thank you so much. So where are all my white men in the room? Raise your hands. Very glad that you're here. Yay. So let me just ask, do you all feel the same way about every issue? I'm going to guess no. Do you all know each other? Oh, well, well, that's not fair in this room, probably, right? But have you all had the same life experiences? The answer would be no. And that is what is so amazing when we start thinking about diversity, and really the other word that I want to bring into the conversation is inclusion. That we think about kind of white men as the norm, and everything else you operate from outside of that norm. And then you're asked to consider your life as it relates to kind of white men who, as we heard from Kate, are overrepresented on the bench. But how can we make sure that we're having conversations so that we recognize for each of my white male allies in the room, they each have unique experiences that they bring to the values of their work every single day. And such is the beauty of every single human and individual. But yet what tends to happen is we group people and we say, well, if you're African American, or if you're Latino, or if you are lesbian, then these are the experiences that you've had. Or if you've been a civil rights attorney, or you've been a prosecutor or defender, all of your experiences are only shaped by that one factor, which is something that I think we all need to try to do a little bit more to challenge people on those points. That even when we talk about diversity and inclusion within our own circles, that we have to push people that just because you have a background, and my last name is Jawando, that there are other things that make who I am and who we all are very real, very important. And while it brings a perspective and advantage to our work, it is not dispositive of any one thing. At this point, I want to start opening up to conversation with everybody, and I'm going to ask my panelists to also chime in, and I'm going to put my friend Deb on the spot because she did some interesting work in Chicago recently, and when we were in Austin, talked with some of our friends about it. And Deb, I'd love for you just to introduce yourself and tell people about some of the things that you've done in Chicago. I don't know if there's a mic, but you're pretty loud. Okay, yeah.
So we've been working in that geographic region, but we recently teamed up with the National Council for Jewish Women to design an experiential learning curriculum where we actually have participants sit as judges in real cases and decide the cases. Then we reveal what really happened in that case and have a conversation then about how the people in that, when we do this in small groups, that when they sit as judges, how their life experiences might have impacted the way that they are deciding these really important cases that are related to public policy that everybody cares about. One's an ACA case, one's a transgender rights case, another one is a nursing mother's case that we've used. And so it's a really been a very fruitful way to have people, again, non-lawyers in particular, start to understand how important it is that we have different kinds of life experiences reflected. And of course, those cases, we purposefully pick cases where people will be like, oh my God, is that really what happened? And of course, all those cases were decided by all white male panels. And so, anyway, Anyway, so, yeah, so I'm sure, be distributing it through Justice and State and other ways, but, yeah, open to any questions.
And Kate, that just reminds me of some of the work that you've done that kind of looked at some of the different systems, and you alluded to it in your kind of comments, but do you want to talk a little bit more about, as we look at judicial elections, I shared, we have a report that looks at when there are states where there's a considerable amount of money spent on elections, that unfortunately now we have research that's going to bear out candidates of color do fare poorly in those situations. Not a huge surprise, right? It's an intrinsic thing that we maybe thought about, but now we have some of the data and research. So do you want to just talk a little bit about what these different systems mean as we think about diversity and inclusion?
I mean, I think the most important thing for advocates to be considering is unpacking the unique challenges that these systems set up. And so within the election context, for example, Michelle, you just flagged that fundraising is one obstacle. So, you know, it's really important to think about fundraising and all of the kind of politicization problems that we've all been discussing for a long time, but it's also important to think about like what impact it's directly having, not only on the decisions that are being made from the bench, but who is sitting on the bench. There are also a number of sort of very specific issues that have to be unpacked in the electoral context. So one issue, for example, we're looking at the Brennan Center right now is the use of racial appeals or racial polarizing language that's used in the election context. So one source of this is TV advertising. So you can kind of code for TV ads that are using kind of a racial appeals. And one query is whether these racial appeals are not only having an impact on the decision making that judges are making, but also on who's getting elected. And that's, for us at least, an open question right now, but something that we have kind of hypotheses about. Another kind of major issue that's been talked about in the electoral context is the way that districts have been drawn. So election districts are drawn differently in different states and on different court levels, and old data shows us that when judges are elected at general elections where the whole state can vote rather than sort of local jurisdictional elections, minority candidates don't do as well. There hasn't been a lot of conversation about this recently for a number of reasons, but mainly because the jurisprudence on this question is not great, and so people stop challenging it in court. But there hasn't been sort of a vibrant conversation about what policy solutions can be. And then I presented some of the obstacles to merit selection in a judicial nominating commissioner context. But I think the one issue that has to be highlighted in this context is that this is not a one-stop shop. If you're going to be talking about judicial diversity in kind of a competent and zealous and advocacy way, it's necessary to actually look at the individual problems that that jurisdiction, that selection system is facing, and come up with a solution that makes sense in context.
Thank you. Suzanne, do you want to add anything?
Oh, no.
Oh, okay. There was hand. And can you just say your name and where you're from? Thanks so much.
I'm R.J. Thompson. I work in the Fair Courts Project at Atlanta Legal, and mostly on judicial diversity and access to justice in the courts. So, Kate, the resource for judicial nominating commissions is particularly interesting for my work, and I have sort of a comment and a question. One that judicial diversity, I think, has to come at all levels, including the JNCs. So I'm interested in more conversation around how we have more diverse JNCs across the board, professional experience, race, gender, sexuality, all of the above. And then also that, you know, sometimes a lot of the onus is put on candidates. And I think, you know, as someone who's done many, many years of anti-oppression training, that for me raises a red flag around this thing that often happens where it's like, well, we put the net out, or we invited folks to our meeting, or, you know, this old sort of storyline about we just didn't get them, they just didn't come. And I think that, you know, more of the responsibility has to be on the selection system, particularly in a place where there's a JNC. So one thing we've been thinking about along those lines is
So I have millions of thoughts about everything you just said, but I will restrain myself. But just to touch on sort of a few of kind of the top lines. So in terms of the diversity of the JNCs themselves, absolutely. So the limited data that exists and research that exists on this question tells us that that a more diverse nominating commission is more likely, controlling for other factors, to produce recommendations of diverse candidates. And so, you know, this thought has been swirling around in my mind also, and I think that there is sort of an obvious next step here after the manual to target the commissioners themselves. One flag about that for the advocates in the room. So I think one of the problems in this area is that there's so much work to be done that it can be sort of paralyzing because you can only do one thing at a time. And so the decision to sort of target the nominating commissioners, knowing that the commissioners themselves may be very, very undiverse, is frustrating because you want to tackle all of these problems. And so kind of one urging I will give is to recognize all of the things you're not solving, but still move forward with one thing that you think will solve a problem. In terms of putting the onus on the candidate, just a couple quick thoughts on that.
And I also want to bring you in here to talk a little bit about pipelining connected to that. So sorry, go ahead.
Great. So the one thing I want to say is that in addition to kind of telling nominating commissioners that they should be doing active recruiting, there is sort of kind of a statutory possibility here or an executive order possibility. There are real legal mechanisms. One of the problems in the diversity context is that because of, you know, the pesky Constitution, it can be difficult to create mandates for what commissioners have to do in order to create a diverse set of recommendations. But one thing that I think we can do is require commissioners to take certain steps like active recruitment, and kind of pursuing that would be useful. The other thing I'll mention is that I think that one recommendation of this manual can be implicit bias testing with sort of like a different level. So implicit bias testing is super easy, it's free, and has some positive side effects. Training is proved to be more effective. It's also harder and more expensive. And so sort of kind of designing this in a way where there's low-hanging fruit, but also an ideal standard.
Suzanne.
You mentioned anti-bias, and what was the other?
Cultural competence.
Cultural competence.
So depending on the audience, call it cultural competency or anti-bias. Really, it's anti-oppression training that is framed in language that is appropriate for a judicial audience.
Got it. Okay. Well, okay. I do know that I think it was Elisa that asked me to check, and I did ask a friend of mine who's on one of the nominating commissions in Arizona, and she said that they did receive implicit bias training, so that's a good thing. They're required by Arizona's Constitution to consider race and ethnicity in applicants, and it's just the overarching or the most important goal is somebody who's competent, the best person. But then also consider, if you have these two people and everything else is equal and they're both equally competent, and one is diverse in terms of the makeup of the court as it stands now, then that person should be the priority in my view. So that's helpful, having that constitutional language, which is kind of surprising, knowing Arizona's other political makeup. And there are several things that we call them our sister bars. We have our state bar, which is a mandatory bar, and then we have our sister bars: Arizona Minority Bar Association, the Black Bar Association, Los Abogados, the Women Lawyers Association. All of those, that have their own priorities. And through this, kind of justice of state coming in, kind of bringing us all together, we are actually able to exchange notes and kind of find out what people are doing and what are some of the things that we're all doing, or that really the Women Lawyers Association was doing the best, that we could kind of copy and offer to our members. And some of those things, like I mentioned earlier, attending the meetings so that they know that we're there and they know that we care and they know somebody's watching. That kind of raises their awareness. We review applications, because we had one African-American woman who had been applying and was not getting through, and people were asking why, and kind of our own biases. I think we were making assumptions about the judicial nominating commissioners, And then finally one judge asked, you know, what's the deal? And she said, read her application and you'll understand why. There were several, you know, little errors. And so we fixed those. She's now a commissioner, which is, you know, like a judge. So we review applications. You know, we have fresh eyes that can do that because the application's like this thick, you know, once you answer questions. We do mock interviews. And, you know, obviously we all know that the more you do interviews, the more comfortable you are and the more your personality and your persona can come through and they can really know who you are as a person. And then we also write letters and make phone calls. I was doing that yesterday on behalf of this Hispanic woman who's running, or not running, it feels like running for a campaign, but who's applying, you know, to be on the, who's applying to be on our Court of Appeals. So I was doing that yesterday on her behalf, and just as an attorney, not as the president, since I'm the former president. So we'll actually have our president, you know, write a letter also. So those are just some of the things we're doing.
That's great. And there was a question in the back.
When I first was appointed to the bench, we had a diverse judicial nominating commission. It's a 9-person for various levels of the court. There were 9 persons on the commission. 3 were appointed by the governor, 3 were appointed by the Bar Association, and then those 6 selected 3 others. Well, as time went on, and it's a statutory provision, the statute was changed, and so at this point now, the governor appoints 6 of them, and well, he actually appoints all 9 because then the bar makes a recommendation of people for 3 of them. And so therein lies the problem. How are other judicial nominating commissions done? I mean, if it's statutory and you have a legislature that is going to basically do what the governor wants that legislature to do, you're stuck with now having all of the people on the commission appointed by the governor. And you know, the governor has made various statements about the kind of people he wants on the bench. And so what can we do? I mean, does other states have their commissions as a part of the Constitution, or how does it work? Because we need to do something to change the actual structure of the Judicial Nominating Committee, because as would be expected, there's very little diversity now coming out of the nominating committee.
Would you mind sharing what state?
Florida.
Okay. Well,
We have a lot of issues.
yes. And we have definitely talked about you. So, so I mean, I think what is fascinating here is that each state really has a unique experience. And one of the things that all of our organizations are working is to, again, fill the kind of data gaps that exist as we examine the different systems. The reality is that I think that there are 3 things that are in the mix. One is you're dealing with the political realities on the ground at any given moment, right? So if Alex Sink, for instance, would have won in Florida, we would have had a very different conversation today, right? And so we both have to examine timeliness of kind of what's happening there, and then at that point be able to identify, are there any kind of both advocates who are already working on kind of making changes or working with legislators to kind of bring recommendations of how you can change different commissions. There's also an argument to be made for identifying allies even when there is quote unquote a hostile governor, right? Are there any type of advocates that for the kind of good and order arguments that can be made for including kind of greater diversity, even if it happens to come from their party, but perhaps 1 or 2 Republicans who are kind of advocating who are maybe African American or Latino, right? So I think there's the electoral challenges of what's happening on the ground. There's 2, kind of identifying who your advocates are. And then 3, there's just the process of looking at each of the structures and getting the information to figure out what you can actually do in your state. And we're all happy to talk to you afterwards. I think a few of us have some ideas about Florida, and that we'll be happy to take. Let me take, I think there was one other question, and then we'll do quick closing remarks.
Thank name's Jake Colassini. I have a political consulting firm that runs almost exclusively diverse candidates for the bench. And I wanted to go back to one of the things that Kate was talking about, which was this racially coded messaging in a lot of political advertising. So I run into this a huge amount with my candidates. And one of the things that I've really noticed is this coded messaging around you know me and can trust me coming from the white candidates that are running against my diverse candidates. And I just wanted to see if that was something that you found a lot of, but I've seen just a ton of it in the folks that are running against my candidates.
So we're in the process right now of kind of coming up with a definition of what a racial appeal is. So kind of one of the gaps in this area is there's a big difference between what you would call a racial appeal if you wanted to bring, for example, a Section 2 challenge under the Voting Rights Act, and what as a policy what for policy reasons you want to call a racial appeal, and what many of us in the room would agree is a racial appeal. And so we're still in the kind of the initial first step of like coming up with a definition of what a racial appeal is in order to code these ads and actually really pull out the proper language. I think what the place that most advocates are in this process is identifying a lot of the low-hanging fruit. So there are a number of ads that people regularly point to as just so kind of unbelievably overtly racist that they demonstrate how far candidates are willing to go. And because that level of overt racism is still on the table, there hasn't been as much digging into the kind of more coded language and the implicit biases and the way those are coming out in elections. And so I don't know how regularly we are seeing that. We haven't done a survey of it, but it's a question that I think is really interesting and important and needs to be delved into.
Kate, you take this opportunity to give your closing remarks or ideas.
Okay, great, will do. I'm gonna take this opportunity to make a shameless plug for something that kind of Justice Quince just touched on. So one other problem in this area is that we don't know that much about how every state functions and how every nominating commission functions and how every selection system functions. One project that the Brennan Center has underway is what we are boldly calling judicial selection for the 21st century. And we are creating a map and kind of interactive tool that will actually lay out the selection system at every court level and the way every single Supreme Court judicial nominating commission selects its commissioners, or how every commission is selected. God help us, Matt Menendez and I have spent the past month trolling the statutes and constitutions for this information. So we're really hoping it will be useful to you all. But I think that is kind of an important first step. So in order to figure out maybe what a better system could be, we need to understand the current systems we have and what about them is and is not working.
I think that we need to continue to talk about diversity and how it's a crucial part of having fair courts, if not in actual practice, which I think it is important in actual practice, but definitely in the perception, and especially in front of the parties, including the attorneys and the clients who are appearing in front of our judges.
And I will just end by also plugging the Center for goodness gracious, Legal Progress. We are working at the Center for American Progress, working on examining kind of judicial elections. So see, you figure out how you work with your friends. We talked about this earlier. Looking at judicial elections and then obviously the effects that has on diversity and inclusion in the various states. And so to the extent that we are all continuing to push our colleagues and friends to have this conversation, this was a great room. You are a wonderful audience, but next time, how do we pack the room? Because I would tend to believe that most of the people in this room are already people working on these issues. And what our charge really is how do we get people who are not like-minded and who haven't had the rich diversity of this conversation even today? How do they get to understand where we are and why this is so important? Unfortunately, there's new research that Black and white and Black and Hispanics and Asians and whites, the gaps between how we perceive incidents is the greatest that it has ever been in the last 50 years. So the way that we see incidents that are happening in Ferguson or Long Island, Staten Island, as we look at these incidents, we're seeing them through very different prisms. Implicit bias answers some of those questions, but it is not the only thing. And so this is an ongoing conversation that has to happen, and it's tough and it's difficult, but it has to be done, and we are at the cutting edge of that. And so I thank you all for your work, for this amazing, diverse, wonderful, smart, sassy panel, and we appreciate you taking the time out to come today. Thank you so much.